Hey everyone, and welcome to this month's Q&A for National Quilter Circle. Once again, we have Colleen back to answer your quilting questions. Colleen, thanks for being here.
Yeah, it's great to be here. I haven't seen you in a while.
No, it has been a while. I feel like a lot of people are saying that to a lot of people right now. I haven't seen you in a while. But we see we have a lot of people on from all over the place, Virginia, North Carolina, Canada, Ohio. So everybody, thank you so much for watching. Again, if you have any quilting questions that you want Colleen to answer, please put those in the orange chat box. Make sure it's the orange one because that's the one that we see live right now. So a couple questions that we already have here. What is your advice for pin basting a quilt of 40 by 60 inches? I bought tables, but I know some people have a system for basting even when your surface is smaller than your quilt.
Oh, true. Okay, so when your surface is smaller, I tend to tackle about a third of the quilt at a time. And you can either accordion fold your quilt top and your back and stretch out just a piece of it at a time. And I tend not to pin baste very much. I tend to spray baste instead. I'm too antsy to get all the pins. The pins are always where I need to stitch or I want to stitch, I guess. But trying to fold that up into like thirds or even quarters so that you can kind of tackle a piece at a time. Now remember, when you're basting a quilt together, the best thing is to start from the center. So if you had your quilt laying out like this, you might want to fold things to the center, and that middle third is the piece that you want to baste down first and kind of move apart and baste that part and then work your way out. Um, since tables tend to be rectangle, position your quilt so that you can keep most of it supported on the table and then work that center piece, or even roll. Some people will use pool noodles, which is a very popular thing. And a lot of us have them in our garages. Our kids have outgrown them and we didn't know what to do with them. So by rolling and scrolling up the pieces of your quilt top, then you can keep those aligned, work on that center section, and then shift, and then keep the weight still away from falling onto the floor, but work a portion of the quilt at a time. So that's kind of how do you, I've heard someone say, how do you eat an elephant? It's one bite at a time. Don't try to swallow the whole thing.
Perfect. I like it. Now I have a reason to go buy some pool noodles. I mean, I don't have a pool or anything, but might as well just go buy some, have them at the ready. So you mentioned
We're going to use them eventually, so.
that's true. Even if we don't have a pool, like sword fighting or something. So you mentioned spray basting. So I'm not someone who's ever really used spray base before. So do you have, I don't know, a go-to one, a favorite one you prefer, a reason you prefer it?
The KK2000 is my favorite. It's by Sulky. The can seems small when you look at it compared to other products on the shelf, but it goes a long way, and a little goes a long way. So that I don't seem to have as much overspray with it, because some of them, when you spray, you can just see it aerosolize and it's everywhere, and you're thinking, oh my. Because you want to use it in an area that either maybe in the garage or in the basement, someplace where you can even open a window to have fresh air. The Sulky doesn't seem to have a lot of odor. It used to. It's gotten a better formula later on, so that I don't seem to notice a really strong odor with it. It stays in place, and I can pick up something that's been basted 2-3 weeks later and it's still just tacky enough to hold in place. It's almost creating kind of like a post-it note kind of adhesive where it's not overly gooey and it doesn't gum up the needle on my machine, and I can easily maneuver around and not have any problem with my stitches. So that's my favorite one.
Perfect. All right. Carol wants to know, what is your best advice for someone who cannot get down on the floor to square up a large quilt?
Okay. I don't think I've ever squared up a quilt on the floor before, because yeah, I would not like having to crawl around to do that. I'm usually working on two like banquet tables, something where I can get a larger surface. The biggest thing when squaring up a quilt, and you've got edges that are maybe uneven, or maybe you've worked on something triangles and you have outer edges you need to straighten up. The thing to do is to go in with a fabric marking pencil or pen mark it first. Because if you happen to not be perfectly square, you haven't cut it off yet. You still have a chance to get it into square. So what I usually do is I lay it out on the table, the portion that I can, at least one long side and a corner. I will use rulers, like an 8.5 by 24, so I have a nice long length. And if I want more, I can tape my 12.5 ruler to the side of it. That packing tape that we have around for sending packages works great to pull two rulers together, tape down that seam so you get a long right angle. That's really important because when you create that right angle on one edge, then you can hopefully shoot and get all of them square all the way around. So using that to draw the line to get that first right angle, and then keep extending and work your way around and see if everything lines up right before you cut. It's kind of like getting a haircut. You can't put it back on once it's cut off. So
That's very true, and it definitely doesn't, grow back at all. You can add different borders, but let's just make sure it's how you want it before you cut it. Perfect.
Right.
Awesome. Well, we have some other questions coming in here. Just want to remind everyone, if you are asking questions, to put it into the orange chat box. Also, you'll probably see a banner on your screen too with a free download. This is for our Quilting from the Comfort of Your Home calendar. So it's a really fun idea. I know, Colleen, you and I were talking earlier. You were saying you need to finish up some projects. And so this is kind of a fun way to get you motivated maybe to finish up a project, because it's a whole calendar that's sort of for a whole week. So you plan what you're going to do Monday, and then you tackle it on Tuesday. You work on it Wednesday. There's something for each day of the week to kind of help you either get started and finish a short project, or get back into that maybe longer project, Colleen, that you need to finish. So download that. That's in the banner there. All right, our next question here, Cynthia says, how do you finish the edges of an art quilt without sacrificing the design?
An art quilt. A lot of times, art quilts, at least the ones I've seen, it shows and things, because I'm not a big art quilter myself, but I do appreciate them because they're absolutely gorgeous works, and my brain doesn't quite work like that. But a lot of art quilts are knife edge finished. So that means that the backing is put on there and the edges are turned to the inside. So the seam along the outside edge is kind of like a pillow turn. It doesn't have a binding on it. So it can actually be that you apply the backing to the front of the quilt, sew all the way around, turn the whole thing right side out, and then close that opening like you would a pillow. That way you don't have to worry about losing too much. At least a 1/4 inch would be all you would lose there. Some art quilts are raw edge finished. They can be just quilted and trimmed, and so the outside edge is just raw, depending on what kind of art quilt you are creating. You can also create a binding that pulls all the way to the back side. So if you quilted it, and the quilting and the thread painting is part of the art of your quilt, you can apply a binding to that outside edge, but then it's all pulled to the back side. So instead of having some of it exposed to the front, most of it's all pulled to the back, and then you would have a little thicker edge along the outside of your quilt. But it kind of depends on the feel and the overall style of that art quilt that you're creating. So,
Yeah.
many choices.
Yeah. So, actually some great examples if you want some more visuals too of some of the same ways that you just mentioned, and some additional ways. We have a lot of videos on National Quilter Circle that a previous instructor, Heather Thomas, did, and she did a lot of art quilts and a lot of different ways of finishing it and finishing the edges, and sometimes not finishing the edges, and having even at sometimes some exposed hand-dyed batting that you can still see. So all sorts of fun ideas. And so she has a bunch on there if you want some more visuals for some ideas. Gail wants to know, any interesting and different border ideas you've seen lately?
Oh, I've seen some absolutely fabulous pieced borders lately that are just to die for. The only thing is you really have to know your math in order to get those to fit properly, or have a floating border between like the center of your quilt and that outer border. You can adjust those. A lot of times we get very controlled on, okay, if I'm going to put a 2-inch border around a quilt, I have to put a 2-inch border all the way around all 4 sides. And if you're using it as a spacer before putting on some fabulous piece border, your eyes can actually correct. So if one needs to be 2 inches and one needs to be 1.5 in order to get the math to work, you're not going to notice it in the overall design in the end. So if you, in the past, if you've always thought, well, it won't work because the math isn't there, you can float those borders to make them the size you need to be to fit a pieced border. Don't think that you have to have all borders being exactly the same size. So that's kind of one of the things that kind of frees us up. And when we kind of let that go and say, oh, I can have a little fun with this. No quilt police is going to arrest me. But piece borders, some really interesting piece borders, they're very intricate that I've seen recently that I'd love to have a little fun time to dabble in, but time.
You can add a piece border to one of these projects you're finishing up. No, but this is a sort of a good follow-up question because I have done quilts in the past that on a much wider scale. So not the difference between 1.5 to 2 inches, but say I put a 2-inch border on the sides, but a 5-inch border on the top and bottom. The person who does the majority of my long arm quilting says that sometimes that can make it more difficult to quilt because whatever design she was wanting to use in one border, you can't really use in the other. So since you do a lot of your own long arm quilting, what are your thoughts on that, and how would you tackle the difference in border widths in terms of choosing a design to quilt on it?
It can make it challenging. I do a lot of free motion, so I'm not locked into sizes as much because if you're doing computerized, then you have to go in and you have to fit the dimensions to fit the space. So if you were running a 2-inch border versus that 3 or 4-inch, then you would have to play with the dimensions to spread and fit the space. But by doing free motion, you can kind of stretch that on your own and fill and keep the same theme maybe going through those, but maybe add some extra fill or background shapes. So you get the same overall flavor in those borders, but maybe one becomes a little bit more intricate. Maybe you need to fill the background a little bit more, put in a couple extra curls somewhere to fit. But because free motion, if you're driving yourself, you can play with it as you go along. So that's why I kind of like free motion.
Yeah, perfect. I like it. All right, our next one here. I'm trying to put together a hexagon together with diamonds between. Do you have any advice on this?
Okay. Hexagons, diamonds in between. Make sure that you think about the construction. I think you're probably going to end up creating diagonal seams as you're going along, and then joining rows together. I've got a flash on my head of a quilt that I did in a video. I don't remember the name of it anymore, but it had hexagons that had diamonds set in beside, and then as the diamonds joined in rows, it looked like they were, or triangles, they looked like diamonds set. But if you're designing yourself, think about the construction so that you can create somewhere in there a simple row to put together. So it might be that you're creating kind of diagonal sections with those hexagons and then how the rows join together instead of trying to, maybe those diamonds are actually going to have to be made from 2 triangles. Just a thought.
Yeah. I actually just made a quilt very similar to that with hexagons and triangles. And yeah, I did not even attempt the diamonds. I just went straight to the triangles. And I used my AccuQuilt to cut out all the hexagons and all the triangles because they have the sets that go together. So the triangle that fits specific size of hexagon. So if you want to speed up your cutting, I would recommend that.
Yep.
All right. Elizabeth says she's heard someone say they baste with spray starch. Have you ever tried this?
Baste with spray starch. That I have not.
Is starch inherently sticky at all? Would there be any? I guess I've never used starch enough or sprayed enough on there for it to actually.
It might be lightly tacky, but I guess because I use like a starch product, it's not actually full strength starch. It might be tacky for a while as it dry, but it would have to be held perfectly flat while it dried. That would be the only drawback that I can think of. Maybe a smaller project possibly, as long as you can get it on evenly. I don't know. Good thing to maybe try it out, see how it
Yeah.
works. I
I
tried
don't.
something small first.
Yeah, absolutely. I've never really even used starch. I don't usually starch my fabric anyway, unless I'm doing, I don't know, turned edge applique or something and
Mhm.
using it. But I don't usually starch it in the prep process. So I'll have to do some more experimenting with starch. Sherry wants to know. She says, "I'm new to quilting. What is the best product to use for marking?"
Okay, when it comes to marking, you have to think about what are the marks for? Are they going to be pressed over at some point? And are those marks going to be visible could they possibly be visible at the end when you're finishing your quilt? Because marking can be used a lot of different ways. We can use marking tools on the back of fabric as a cutting line or a stitching line. It could be used as a line to follow to do machine quilting or hand quilting. So there's a lot of different ways it's used. So the biggest thing you need to think about is, will that marking tool show up on my fabric and be visible enough? Because like a light yellow isn't going to show up on a navy blue unless it's a ceramic pencil. Then it will. If it's a marker, it's going to it's going to soak in and you won't see the line. So you really need to probably have in your arsenal of marking tools as many as I have in my drawer. I have ceramic pencil. I have just a mechanical pencil. I have friction pens, and I have the air erasable and the iron-on off style. So and chalk liners. So it really depends on how you're using it. I wish I knew a little bit more about what she was wanting it specifically to use. Because if it's one of the air erasable, you're going to have to make sure that you do the stitching or the marking or the cutting soon because it will go away. If it's the friction pen, I would advise only using it on the back side of fabric because it does erase with heat, but sometimes on darker colors it leaves what we call a ghost line. So you'll get a white kind of a line. So keep those for the back side of your fabrics. Um, if it was like a placement line or something, use something that's at least machine washable. So read all of the instructions and all the details about, and then get quite a few different ones. Support your local quilt shop.
That's funny. So I know, so we've done these live events in the past, you and I, and we always have things that we're fairly different on. And I think this is another one where this is pretty much my marking pencil for everything. It's just a regular mechanical pencil. And if
Oh,
my fabric is darker, I just draw my line a little darker. And if it's lighter, I draw it a little lighter. I just kind of go with that. But yeah, I totally agree that, yeah, have a bunch depending on what you need to use it for, but where you say to try it out first, test it out, make sure it does remove or things like that. That's, yeah, always
again, it's pointing my eye because I have older eyes than you. So that's why I need something I can see a little bit more. I used to use a mechanical pencil a lot, but as I get older, I think I need something that shows up better.
fair enough. All right, all right. Okay, Vicky says, how do you feel about that powdered basting product? You iron the batting and top and then the batting and backing.
I have heard about it, but I have not had a chance to use it. Trying to remember the name of the product.
Is it the 007 one? That
I
one?
don't know for sure if that's it or not. I can't
Okay.
remember. There is another company out there, I think Bonesh or something, that has a powder product too that I've heard people say good things about, but I haven't had a chance to actually try it myself. So
Gotcha.
can't really give you too
I
much.
say I don't know either if this is the same one I do, but I do know we have a video on National Quilter Circle where an instructor is using I'm gonna call it powdered adhesive essentially. She didn't call it a basting product, but same thing. You sprinkle it down, you put your fabric on, and you iron it, and it does obviously stick your layers together. So we do have a video on that. I don't know if it's the same one you're referring to, but I would assume that the technique is probably similar to what you are using. right, next one here. Debbie says she's wondering if there are any tips for pressing the spots where lots of points meet. It seems to get bulky.
The biggest thing on intersections like that is to kind of try and plan ahead if you can, to try to get seams to twirl, kind of going in like a clockwise or a counterclockwise direction, so you can reduce the bulk as much as possible. The biggest thing I think is to, if you're going to press, try not to press too aggressively, because you can get distortion, and then you get a shininess to the fabric, and then you're just not happy either. So I think that the biggest thing with that is to plan ahead, especially if you have like 6 and 8 seams coming together, is to step by step think about which direction the seam allowances have to go, so that they kind of nest together to kind of reduce the amount of bulk. It's going to be, there's no way to get rid of it, because when you have that many seams to come together, and like an 8 and a star that has 8 pieces that come together, it's always going to be thick there. So do the best you can, give yourself a little grace, and move on to the next block.
Yeah. Perfect. Well, and that's one thing too, getting seams to nest, because sometimes a pattern will have, perfect pressing instructions and you follow it and everything comes together perfect. Sometimes, maybe you're making up your own design and you get to that point and you've already pressed seams one direction and there's kind of no way to undo it because you've already sewn over it. But I don't know if this is a way you should be doing it, but if I need to press a seam the other way, I have just kind of trimmed into that seam allowance about a 1/2 inch back and just pressed that little edge the other direction so my seams will nest. So that way you don't have to undo the whole thing. You only need that little bit to nest and then you're good.
Exactly. And you must have been working over my shoulder, because I've done the same thing.
Oh, see, we do some things that are the same. Perfect.
Snip, you're going the other way.
Yep, all the time. Perfect. All right, our next one here, Jana says she's making a simple quilt with 5-inch squares surrounding a 2-inch banding. It's 6 squares wide by 7 squares long. I will cut 2-inch by 5-inch pieces for between each square, then long bands for between the rows. Do you recommend that the long pieces go across with narrower width or vertically on the longer length?
And is she talking about, I was trying to follow along. Is she talking about cutting it lengthwise versus cutting it crosswise grain?
I'm in my head, and I don't know that I'm interpreting it 100% correctly either, but I'm just picturing a block, and I think she's asking, do you put the sides on first and the top, or the top and then the sides?
Okay.
That's what
Okay. Yeah. That is a personal preference, and just pick one direction and do it all the same.
Mhm.
Because you're going to look at the quilt, say the short sides and then the top and bottom, but somebody else might look at the quilt from the other direction. And guess what? It's just the opposite. So just be consistent. Pick one way to do it. Lay them all out consistently the same. That would be the quilt behind me. The squares. It's a square in the center, and then short bars, long bars, short bars, long bars. Just keep repeating it. And if you're doing that process more than once, keep with the same rhythm, so that the short bars are always on the left and right. Do that throughout. So, yeah. That's what I do.
I think, is that the way you always do it? Because that's the way I always do it, whether it's a block or whether it's the entire quilt and that's the borders. I'm always sides first, then top and bottom.
Yeah, left and right. The only time that I may have, if I can think about it, if I think about it far enough into the quilt, at some point, if cutting border strips means that I can get a full length and I don't have to piece, I might cheat then, but usually I tend to, because of the magazine I used to work for, we used to write patterns that way: left and right border first, top and bottom borders last.
Yeah.
So it was just kind of rhythm that I got into, and I think a lot of patterns are kind of written that way. But if you're writing your own or doing your own thing, all of a sudden you realize, what do those pattern writers do?
Or you're like, what do I feel like doing today?
Exactly.
Perfect. All right, Margie says that she loves the blue and purple quilt on the wall behind you. Is that a pineapple pattern?
Yes, it is. It is a pineapple quilt made with the Creative Grids pineapple trim tool. And there are actually 2 tools. There's a larger one and a smaller one. And let me grab real quick. I got it a little too far from myself. The red one, if you look on my other shoulder there, that's the red one laying in wait. These are the small blocks that I made using the smaller tool of that. And because the trim tool makes it easy, all you have to do is cut strips, and you don't have to cut all these funky shapes, because if you were to actually look at how small these are, the smallest triangle in here is about the size of my fingernail. So who would want to just cut shapes like that? Not me, not ever, not going to happen. But with a trim tool, it was really easy to make the small blocks, and then the larger ones behind me were done very scrappy version using batiks, turquoises and blues, and then purples on the other direction. So it was a fun adventure.
Perfect. I love it. Awesome. Well, Sherry says, I am fairly new to quilting. Never thought I could do it. And I want to know, what is the best thread weight to use in stitching?
The biggest thing with thread, trying to not have to pick up one and even think about it. 50 weight is a very common used weight. This one's a little bit heavier, I guess. Because usually I don't get that question. It's usually whether or not you use 100% cotton versus cotton polyester. So now I have to think about my thread weight, because I just normally just pick up what I have in my drawer. But let's see. I gotta find. So this one's 100% polyester, and that's a Gutermann thread. This one's a Madeira thread, and this one I can't even find the weight on it. And this one is Superior thread. So I use just about everything, and I use a lot of Aurifil also, which is a good piecing thread. When you go to the quilt shop, it'll be labeled whether or not it's top stitch thread, which is going to be heavier, or if it's a finer thread. But 50 to 60 weight is common for piecing. You get into, and numbers on thread are really confusing, because the size of the thread has to do with how many strands fit into a certain space. So if you get into something that says it's an 8, it's very, very large, because not very many of them will fit through this hole. So that's like embroidery flosses and pearl cottons and things like that. So when you get into really fine threads, it's going to be a 60, 70, 80. And the bigger the number, the finer the thread. So, and a lot of those are embroidery threads, the really fine things that are almost, you can barely see them to thread a needle. So, but match your thread to what you're working on if you're piecing. Some people are into the 100% cotton, and that's totally fine, but polyester works too.
Yeah. A combination of 40, 50, or 60, and then either 100% cotton or all purpose, which is cotton poly blend, a little bit of everything in terms of thread. And I also, you were saying you were looking on your thread and you couldn't find where it said the weight. So all of mine behind me, he was 2.5 at the time, but they all had stickers on the bottom. And one day he thought it was be real. Every single sticker is gone. So there's no more labeling on any of the thread at all. But that's just one thing, whereas like once you get used to, if you always use a 50 weight thread, as soon as you pick up one that's not, you're going to know it. Like you're going to be able to recognize that subtle difference. So if it seems heavy, it's probably not the right one to be using,
Yep, exactly.
Yeah. All right. How do you know which presser foot to use when quilting? Machine quilting versus free motion, darning foot, or walking foot, etc.
Okay. Okay, so when we talk about walking foot, let's see if I can even grab mine real quick. A walking foot, they vary, depends on which machine, what brand you have. Some, there are dual feeds that are even bigger yet than this. There are built-in walking foot on some brands too. So, but a walking foot usually is used for straight line quilting. So when you are going to go in and do stitching in the ditch, or you're going to do straight outlining, this is the tool of choice that you're going to need, because it helps to keep the fabric from shifting, because if they're batting in between your fabrics, it has that little bit of shift that can happen. And the feed dogs on the back of this, along with the ones in your machine, keep things feeding through evenly, so you don't give a shift in the fabric one over the other, so everything stays aligned nicely. Free motion foot, or a darning foot. They vary. Let's see if I can pull out one. I've got a couple of different ones. This one is a hook shaped. It has kind of a spring to it. These are kind of what I call a hopper foot. Looks similar to the kind that are on a long arm machine, but that allows you to easily slide over the fabric and not and be able to see everything where you're going. There are some that are round, that are plastic. They're kind of cup shaped that help you slide and glide over fabric too. Maybe not as easy to see exactly where you're at. You can't see the needle as easily as with you can with a hopper foot like this. Other than that, those are the two that these are my two go-tos for a straight line and for free motion on my domestic machine. So I'm not sure, Ashley, what's your go-to foot on a machine?
Well, for quilting, my go-to is to send it to my friend Penny, who does amazing quilting. No, okay, but I do have a walking foot on my machine too for straight line, or for if you're gonna do, I mean, it's still straight line, but a decorative stitch of a straight line. And then I do have the darning foot as well. And then I like the open toe one, not the one that's the full circle, just so that you can see it just a little bit better where you're going to be going if it's not the full circle. So it's more of like, well, it's a C. It's an open toe part. Yeah. So that would be my
And
favorite.
even on a walking foot, you can get one that has a more open slot in there too. Because I know on my first machine, I had to buy a universal foot because the machine didn't come with one. There wasn't one available. And it just had a little tiny line in where the thread would slide in there, and you couldn't see where you were going. It was frustrating. And there are ones available with a lot more open visibility for you to see where you're going. So if you're outlining or you're trying to stay a quarter inch from a stitching liner in the ditch, I would advise trying to find the one with the most open foot possible.
Yes, that's a good question. I'm going to ask you. So when you piece, are you using a 1/4 inch foot or are you using a regular presser foot?
I'm actually using a regular one. I first started on a machine that I couldn't move the needle position, and I had to put a piece of tape down. And getting my 1/4 inch seam was a chore. And finally got to switch to a different machine, thanks to my husband. And it came with a 1/4 inch foot, but it had the one with the guard, the shield on the side. And so that really helped me at the very beginning to get a visual of what my 1/4 inch seam needed to look like. It's kind of like, bumper bowling. It's bumper quilt sewing.
Yeah.
The little bumper on the edge. But once I got used to that, then I can kind of visualize where the 1/4 inch seam was better. And a 1/4 inch foot has a narrower front piece, and you follow that along the edge. At some point, I don't exactly know why I switched over to this, but maybe because this machine had more needle position variability for me, is that I use just a regular, and I can think what letter it is. They're all alphabetized, and this is the T foot, I believe. It's a zigzag foot, basically.
Yeah.
And I can change the needle position to get the 1/4 inch to run the edge of this. So then I set that as my default. So it always goes to that as my 1/4 inch net needle position so that I can use the outside edge of my foot, because I'm really notorious for forgetting, because some people like to use the round needle hole, and I would break a needle if I had that kind on my machine. I can guarantee you I would snap a needle. This way, if I'm going back to a zigzag or some other stitch, I don't have to change my foot.
Yeah.
So it's kind of a lazy foot for me.
So that's what I was going to ask you, because this is the 1/4 inch foot that I use, and it's just the teeny tiny opening. And so, knock on wood, I have not broken a needle with this machine, but my old machine, the foot had a little like indentation of where I had done that like 100 times of like lowered the needle down into the foot, and there was just this little,
Yeah, little divot.
Yeah, because I was going to ask you if you do only have, say, this kind of, or you prefer to use this kind of 1/4 inch foot when you're doing your 1/4 inch seam, when you're sewing something where you've marked a line and it's your stitching line, do you swap out your foot so you can actually see that line better, but you don't actually have that problem if you are
Right.
always using that foot. Yep.
Yeah. And this is the foot that has also has a plastic, so I can see through it in the center. And some of them are solid metal or more of a thick here, so that you can't see. But because that plastic shield I can see through, I put the needle position back to center, and then I can drive right down the middle.
Yep.
And there's a notch on the foot, so my eye just kind of falls at that notch, and it feeds right into that, the marking on the foot as it goes through. So because I don't like to slow down, that's why I go to the lazy foot. I can sew whatever from with this one and not have to worry about it. So
There you go. Perfect. All right, our next question here, Dawn says she's looking for grown-up flannel for a one-piece throw, no plaid. Any suggestions for a source?
oh my. I'm trying to think of brands. I mean, flannel comes. I mean, most of the companies produce some flannels. It's just finding. It kind of depends on if you're looking for something more feminine or something kind of in between. If you're not looking for plaid, that would be tough. I guess I would probably check with some of the Moda lines because they produce a lot of lines to see what they have available.
Yep.
But yeah, Google search is going to be your best choice, I'm
Yeah.
afraid.
Yep. And
And
for
I
something like that too, I mean, I've ordered more fabric online lately than I've ever have before in the past, but I've ordered from places like if I have a specific line of 100% quilting cotton that I want, like I'll go search out at a quilt shop that I know I can find that. But if I'm just looking for a random fabric, maybe like this, fabric.com actually has a bunch, and I've ordered from there before. So you'd probably be able to find something there if you don't have a specific shop or something in place, or a brand that you're looking for. That might be at least a good starting spot to look for different ones. Anne wants to know, do you have any suggestions for hanging a wall quilt in my sewing room? You might have a few hanging behind you.
Just a few. When it comes to wall quilts, if they're small things, the best thing to do is to put a rod pocket across the back and just big enough to put maybe a dowel rod through because usually wall quilts are fairly lightweight. You don't have to support too much heavy. You don't have to worry about distortion or ripping or tearing or anything like that. I have in the past used curtain rod. You could use a small tension rod. Anything that you can slide through there, whatever you have access to. The biggest thing is, I guess. I have done loops at the top and put a decorative bar or stick or something through that to hang from, and then suspended that. But I kind of like that clean look of putting the pocket on the back down about an inch from the top, and then leaving a couple of places where I can put in like 2 nails or 2 hooks and not stitch, and so I can hook it into that to support the weight and get that nice clean against the wall look. So
yeah, I like it. Are all the quilts, so I know the pineapple one is, but the quilts behind you, they're not all quilted, right? Some are just quilt tops. So how would you, obviously you haven't finished it yet, so if you're going to hang just the quilt top, I mean, are you just putting like thumbtacks through the corners, or how are you hanging those ones up?
These guys over here are on a design wall at this point. You can purchase actual design walls that are like a vinyl tablecloth that has a flannelly back. This one has grommet holes along the top. If I can change my angle just a little bit. But at the very top there's just grommets, and I actually just put push pins in the wall to support the grommets because it's very, very small. It can be taken out because I'm actually in a townhouse, so I don't own this place. And that way it's very easy to spackle over and not make any big, addition to the wall. Because I can put up about a full-size bed quilt on this design wall. You can use the same thing. A very inexpensive tablecloth, vinyl picnic cloth works. I've also had in the past. I've used insulation board that was covered with felt as a design wall. So it's kind of a fun way to have a varying wall behind you or in your area that you can put your blocks up and arrange things. It's kind of like having, an art show that constantly, hopefully, changes. The baby quilt is going to get quilted this weekend because that's for a grandson coming next month, so it needs to be done. So that one is going to be going out. The pineapples, I don't know for sure how many more I'm going to make. I have, I think, a 12 blocks. That's 9 there, but I think I have 12 altogether made. And it's probably just going to be a wall quilt. I don't think with that many seams it would be a good idea for a bed quilt. It would be awful heavy. Or it could be a table runner. So we'll see how that gets going.
See, and now that's another thing too, is you get to hang them on your design wall and then decide what you're going to do with them.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
And it's really good because if you walk into the room and if you're working on something, it's good to have them hanging in there because as you walk in, sometimes you realize, oh, that guy has to change. Or these need to move.
Yeah, absolutely. And speaking of deciding what you're going to do with said project that you're working on or that's hanging on your design wall, we talked a little bit earlier about the free download we have on the banner that is either above or below the video you're watching right now. And that's for our Quilting from the Comfort of Your Home calendar. And so it lays out a whole week for you, again, of planning it on Monday, tackling it on Tuesday. So it's Thoughtful Thursday. And that is to think about what you're going to do with the project or who's going to get it, because I feel like I am more motivated to actually finish something if it has a recipient or it has like an already, purpose of what I'm going to use it for. But if I'm just kind of making it because I think I might want to, it sits a little bit longer than some of those others. So download that calendar and follow every day of the week.
Yeah.
Perfect. All right. Next question here. What stitch length would you recommend for piecing? Not sure if I should be changing the stitch length that I use. I use a 2.5. Don't know why I choose this one. Your thoughts would be appreciated.
My machine just has a default, and when it's in the piecing, this machine has like two mines. It has one for just garment sewing, that kind of sewing, and the default stitch is a little bit longer. When it goes into the quilt mode, it takes my stitch length to 2.0. And usually using that shorter stitch is a good thing because you don't get popping of seams at the ends of your intersections. So 2.0 is what mine defaults to, and that's what I use.
Mm-hmm. Yep. I think you and I have talked about this before too. Mine defaults to the 2.5 just when you turn it on. It doesn't have the 2 mine sets, I guess. And so I always just leave it at 2.52. But like when I'm interested to see if you do this at all. When I'm putting together just my pieces that make up the blocks, I don't do obviously any back stitching or anything like that. But when I'm actually putting my blocks together, the ones that are going to be at the ends, I will do a back stitch so that the whole thing, I feel, in my mind, it makes it all come together and stay together a little bit better. It's maybe not necessary, but is that something that you have heard of at least?
It's actually something with the same kind of thought in process that I've done. When I've taken mine to be long armed, a lot of times I'll go around the outside and stay stitch by crossing those seams because
Yep.
when you're putting it on a long arm, you are putting some tension on the seams and it can pop the last stitch or so. So what you do does help secure those for that long arming process since you're sending it out, which your long armor loves you for it. And that just gives it that much more stability so that when they're putting it on, they keep everything in line and you don't have to worry about a seam popping. So perfect.
All right, perfect. See, so it's 2 different ways you can do it. It's either the back stitch or the going around stitching all the way around. Perfect. Next one here. What do you think of the quilt as you go method?
I have used it in 1 or 2 instances. Um, it's a different approach if you aren't comfortable or don't have the ability to draw a large quilt through either your domestic machine or if you don't have access to using a long arm. It's a wonderful way to create your own quilted pieces and accomplish it in smaller bites. So I do like the process because I know I have taught machine quilting, and when people on for the domestic machine, and when people are working on just that square, they're like, "Oh, I love this! I can do this!" And then they get home and they call me later and say, "But when I have this big quilt, yeah, it's a huge monster to deal with, and it takes a lot of practice." So that if you want to be able to quilt nicely individual blocks and do something fancy on your own, it is a good method. You do have to realize that you're going to have seams on the back and there's going to be some more hand stitching in there and some thought process of how that goes together. But it is a good approach if you want to complete the quilt yourself. And there are quilters who really want to do all of their own quilt, and it makes it doable.
Yep, absolutely. And it doesn't mean that you could only ever do quilts as you go, but it definitely is a good sort of springboard starting, get you comfortable with quilting, and then eventually you either decide you're going to do it enough that you justify the purchase of a long arm, or you know, get better at manipulating those larger quilts on your regular sewing machine that you piece it on. So it has a couple benefits there. Next one here, I just started with applique. There are so many techniques. How do I choose the best for each situation? Needle turn, starch, interfacing. It's very confusing.
Yes. I think the one thing to start with is, what are you attracted to? Do you like that smooth edge that's rolled under and stitched? And are you drawn to that kind of artwork, knowing that it's going to take you a longer process? Or are you, I want to get it done because this is something I'm going to have just for a season, or it's just going to be for a certain occasion, and I just want to get it done and not worry about that the edge, maybe it's going to be zigzagged or it's going to be blanket stitched on the edge. And if that's an acceptable finish, then that's the direction for you to go. It also means, can my machine do that too? Because some machines don't have the capability to do maybe a blanket stitch or whatever on the edge. So you kind of need to really examine the processes, decide which fits your personality, because I know people who do beautiful needle turn and it's just gorgeous. It's an artwork all of its own. I don't have the patience to. I've done some of it. I can say I've done some of it, and I realize that I am not that patient to do that meticulous work to get the round berries and the little leaves so beautifully done. And I will reserve that and enjoy someone else's artwork that way. If I can, my machine will do a blanket stitch, and I have the fusible. I'm going that direction.
Mhm.
So
Yeah.
it's pretty much be honest offering. Ah, there we are.
All right, we're back. We had a little bit of a hiccup there, but we were talking about fusibles and blanket stitches, which are two of my favorite things. But I was saying that I pretty much have not done applique for the longest time without using a fusible and without doing a blanket stitch. Like, that's just my preferred method. So I 100% agree with you to just find what you like to look at and what you like to do also, because you may like you said, the very nice edges of the turns, but if you know that you're never going to finish a project, if you start, like, know what you want to be able to do also. Perfect. All right, any suggestions on a quilt pattern for jelly rolls? I need to fit a king bed, but be simple because I'm a new quilter.
Okay, jelly roll and king size is going to mean you're going to need 3 or 4 jelly rolls. So the biggest thing is that when you're using a jelly roll is to find a pattern that's written for that, because a jelly roll means that you're going to be using a variety of fabrics.
Mhm.
It's not going to have it's going to have a very scrappy appearance, unless you're going to pair it with a background. That might be able to give you that the quiet space in between the colors if you're using very dense colors, unless you like the appearance of a very scrappy look. There are a lot of patterns out on the internet that are made for pre-cuts. So look for patterns that are made, designed for pre-cuts, 2.5-inch pre-cuts. Jelly Roll is the Moda name for them. Other companies have other names. So look for patterns with pre-cuts. That will give you the widest throw, and see if you can narrow down that pool of patterns, because there are a lot.
Yep.
Every magazine, every company, manufacturer has come up with something, and there are a lot of free ones
Mhm.
online. So kind of look and maybe create a Pinterest folder, because I think we might all have that.
I think we all do, but I do think that the more Pinterest folders I end up with, the more projects I end up with. So it's not
We
helping.
will.
But we definitely have a lot of different videos to pick from on National Quilter Circle about jelly rolls. like you mentioned, we have a lot of free content as well. But so sort of simple tutorials on how to make just, here's a couple of blocks you can make with jelly rolls, to we even have a full class, The Joy of Jelly Rolls, I believe it's called. So with multiple different ideas and patterns provided with that class, and also she shows some books too, some different books that you can find that are all patterns made from jelly rolls. So while there are pattern books that are, here's a book, for pre-cuts, so it'll have, here's one that's a jelly roll, here's one that's a layer cake, here's one that's, it's a bunch of different pre-cuts together. There are, books or patterns that are made just for one specific pre-cut. So get a bunch of different options for the one that you have. But
And if you're a beginner, I would say start with something very simple.
Yeah.
Maybe something like a rail fence that you can accomplish and complete. Because as a beginner, if you get into a lot of extra cutting and directions and things, you might get yourself into the weeds and then get frustrated. And we would really love to see you finish. So stay with something very simple. The fewer the seams, the better.
Mm-hmm.
And that will give you a good outcome.
Yes, absolutely. When you are working with jelly rolls or other pre-cuts, so the majority, I'm going to say like 90% of them have a pinked edge, right? So all those teeny tiny little triangles. When you are working with them, do you line up on the outside, on the mountaintop, or down in the valley, or do you measure to figure out which one you need to be using, or how do you handle pre-cut fabrics?
Yeah, it's the time to take the ruler out and find out where the actual 2.5, because you're going to be taking out your seam allowances, and what you really want is the 2-inch strip left that's down the middle. So you need to actually measure that, because every company is a little tiny bit different, and on where that 2-inch strip that you need, because the pattern's going to be written, the math is going to be done for you to have 2-inch strip of fabric when you get done, when your seams are taken out. So really take a measurement to make sure where you need to be stitching. Do you need to follow the peak, or do you need to follow the valley? And if that peak is going to annoy you, or the valley is going to annoy you, maybe you have to go in and trim. If it's larger than the 2.5, trim some of the peaks away so that you can really hone in on that 1/4 inch seam. Because as a beginner, that's what you need to really get used to, is that 1/4 inch seaming, so that you have an accurate outcome.
Yeah, I did do that one time, trimming off one that was, they differ from manufacturer to manufacturer, right? So sometimes when you measure it right on the outsides, you're perfect at 2.5, and sometimes they are a little bit bigger. And so I thought it would be a great idea to go ahead and just trim those off. That was the messiest experience I've ever had. So maybe think that through though before you, there you go, lint roller. Okay. Think that through before you trim off literally hundreds of those little mountains per strip, and there's 42 strips. So that's going to be pretty messy. All right. Next question here. What is the best way to square up vertical edges of a quilt that are 100 inches long prior to adding the vertical border pieces?
Okay, so when you put on borders, you should have them accurately cut to start with. So the only portion you should be worrying about squaring is when you've added a piece, getting the right angle. So that's when you get out your 12.5 square or your 14.5 square and align that to trim the corner. So you shouldn't have to. If you evenly cut your borders, accuracy is important. So, back to the beginnings, when you're cutting borders, those should be consistent width all the way down. So you shouldn't have to do much trimming in that point. If you do, I don't know for sure where to go on that one after that point.
Yeah. Well, like I said, I think accuracy from the very, very beginning, the very first square block, everything you start putting together, if you're checking it sort of at every step along the way, then like you said, by the time you get to that point, you shouldn't have to have any major adjustments needed.
Let's hope not.
Absolutely. Perfect. Well, I want to remind everyone again that we do have that free download that you can download by clicking on the banner either above or below the video, and that's the Quilting from the Comfort of Your Home calendar. A little fun thing to, again, get you going into a new project or finish up another maybe unfinished project you've got in the works. A little bit of extra motivation there. But I want to thank you, Colleen, for being here to answer all of our quilting questions.
Thanks. I really enjoy being here. It's fun to share time with you and with quilters all over the world.
Absolutely. Now I think we all need to go finish up some projects.
Yep. To the long arm I go.
Yeah, perfect. Awesome.